Hello and welcome to Nighttime Biographies. Imagine a man who wrote that all men are created equal while owning more than 600 human beings across his lifetime. Picture a thinker who championed individual liberty while leading a nation that denied freedom to millions. Consider a revolutionary who fought against tyranny yet wielded absolute power over the people who worked his lands, sold their children, and controlled whether they could marry, learn to read, or ever know freedom. This is the story of Thomas Jefferson, 3rd President of the United States, primary author of the Declaration of Independence, and one of the most influential architects of American democracy. His words still echo through courtrooms and classrooms. His face is carved into mountains and printed on currency. The ideals he articulated have inspired liberation movements across 2 centuries and 6 continents. Every American schoolchild learns his name. Every 4th of July celebrates the document he drafted. Yet Jefferson himself was a walking contradiction. He preached the dangers of debt while dying more than $100,000 in arrears. He warned against the corruption of cities while creating a capital city. He advocated for strict interpretation of the Constitution while making the Louisiana Purchase, doubling the size of the nation through an action the Constitution did not explicitly authorize. He championed education for all while fighting to keep enslaved people illiterate by law. He wrote passionately about the evils of slavery while making his fortune from it, and fathering children with an enslaved woman he owned. How does one man contain such contradictions? How do we reconcile the soaring ideals of the Declaration with the brutal realities of Monticello? And what do we do with a legacy so intertwined with both the best and worst of the American experiment? These questions have no easy answers, but perhaps that is fitting. Jefferson himself believed that each generation must question what came before, that no truth should be accepted without examination, that independence of mind was the highest virtue. He would have expected us to wrestle with his contradictions. He might even have approved. Tonight, we will trace the life of this remarkable and deeply flawed human being. We will walk the halls of Monticello and the corridors of power. We will watch him draft words that would change the world and make decisions that would haunt his conscience. We will see him as he was, in all his brilliance and all his moral failures, and try to understand how someone could see so clearly in some directions, while remaining willfully blind in others. Before we begin this journey into the contradictions of genius, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. I'm always curious where in the world you're watching from tonight, so please leave a comment and let me know. And now settle in. Let the noise of the modern world fade away. We travel to Colonial Virginia, to a world of tobacco plantations and Anglican churches, of Enlightenment ideals and human bondage, to understand the world that shaped the man who would help create a new nation. The Virginia that Thomas Jefferson was born into in 1743 was not yet America. It was a British colony, and it had been for more than a century. The land along the James River and the tributaries of the Chesapeake Bay had been cleared and cultivated, transformed from wilderness into an agricultural empire built entirely on tobacco and human slavery. The colony operated on a rigid hierarchy. At the top stood the great planter families, men who owned thousands of acres and hundreds of enslaved people. These families, the Randolphs, the Carters, the Byrds, the Lees, formed an aristocracy as entrenched as any in Europe. They dominated the House of Burgesses, Virginia's legislative assembly. They served as justices of the peace and county lieutenants. They married each other's children and accumulated land through inheritance and strategic purchase. Below them stood smaller planters, men with a few hundred acres and perhaps a dozen enslaved workers. Below them, the small farmers who worked their own land. And at the bottom of white society, the landless labourers, indentured servants, and poor whites who struggled for survival. But this was only the white hierarchy. Alongside and beneath it existed a parallel world of enslaved Africans and their descendants. By 1743, black people made up more than 40% of Virginia's population. They were property defined by law as chattel, things that could be bought, sold, inherited and used as collateral for loans. Virginia's entire economy rested on their labour. The tobacco that made the great planters wealthy was planted, tended, harvested, cured, and packed by enslaved hands. The society that emerged from this foundation was one of stark contradictions. Virginia's gentry prided themselves on their refinement and learning. They read London newspapers and the latest books from Europe. They built grand houses and filled them with imported furniture. They spoke eloquently about liberty and the rights of Englishmen, and they did all of this on the backs of people they claimed to own as completely as they owned their horses or their land. Into this world on April 13th, 1743, at a plantation called Shadwell in what was then Goochland County, Virginia, a boy was born to Peter Jefferson and Jane Randolph Jefferson. They named him Thomas. Peter Jefferson was a surveyor and planter, a self-made man in a society that valued inherited status. He had been born into relative poverty, but had built a substantial estate through his own efforts. He mapped vast stretches of Virginia wilderness, work that was both dangerous and profitable. He owned several thousand acres and approximately 30 enslaved people. He was not one of the great planters, but he had achieved respectability and comfort. Jane Randolph was something else entirely. She was a Randolph, one of the first families of Virginia. Her lineage connected her to virtually every important family in the colony. To marry a Randolph was to marry into the aristocracy, and Peter Jefferson's marriage to Jane elevated his status considerably. Their children would be Randolphs on their mother's side, which in Virginia society meant everything. Thomas was their third child and first son. He would eventually have 5 sisters and 1 brother who survived to adulthood. The family lived at Shadwell, a plantation that sat in the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains, at the edge of settlement, where cultivated fields gave way to forest and the wilderness began. The house at Shadwell was comfortable but not grand. Peter Jefferson was still building his fortune, still acquiring land, still working to secure his children's futures. The plantation operated like hundreds of others across Virginia. Enslaved workers grew tobacco in the fields, tended livestock, cooked meals, washed clothes, cared for children, and performed every task required to maintain the household and farm. Young Thomas would have seen slavery from his earliest moments of consciousness. The woman who nursed him was almost certainly enslaved. The children he played with in his early years were enslaved. The hands that prepared his food, cleaned his clothes and maintained his home belonged to people his father owned. This was not unusual or remarkable to him. It was simply the world as it existed, the foundation of everything he knew. The landscape of Shadwell would mark Jefferson forever. The mountains rising to the west, the forests full of game, the rivers cutting through the Piedmont, all of this would shape his aesthetic sense and his vision of what America should be. He would spend his entire life trying to recreate this Virginia landscape wherever he went, trying to return to the mountains and forests of his childhood. But the young boy at Shadwell could not yet know what role he would play in history. He was simply a planter's son, privileged by birth, educated in the assumptions of his class and time, growing up in a world that seemed permanent and unchanging. the revolution that would transform everything, the independence he would declare, the contradictions he would embody, all of that lay decades in the future. For now, there was only Shadwell, the mountains, and the long, slow Virginia days of a childhood that would never entirely leave him. Education in colonial Virginia was a private matter, reserved for those who could afford it. Public schools did not exist. The sons of great planters were tutored at home or sent to small private academies. The daughters received whatever instruction their parents deemed appropriate, usually focused on accomplishments that would make them suitable wives. The children of small farmers learned what their parents could teach them, and enslaved children learned nothing at all, forbidden by law from being taught to read. Thomas Jefferson's education began at age 5 when he was sent to a small school run by a man named William Douglas. Douglas was a Scottish clergyman who operated a boarding school for the sons of local planters. For the next 5 years, young Thomas lived with Douglas, learning Latin, Greek and French, studying classical texts, and absorbing the education considered essential for a Virginia gentleman. The separation from home at such a young age was not unusual. Elite families believed that boys needed to be toughened, removed from the softening influence of mothers and sisters. But for Thomas, the experience seems to have been formative in unexpected ways. He became bookish, withdrawn, more comfortable with texts than with people. The gregarious sociability that marked Virginia's gentry never came naturally to him. In 1752, when Thomas was 9, his father made a decision that would change the family's circumstances dramatically. Peter agreed to serve as guardian for the children of his friend William Randolph, who had died leaving young heirs. To fulfill this obligation, Peter moved the entire Jefferson family to Tuckahoe, the Randolph estate east of Shadwell, closer to the settled parts of Virginia. Tuckahoe was a different world. The plantation was far grander than Shadwell, the house more elegant, the surrounding society more refined. Here, Thomas encountered the full flowering of Virginia's planter aristocracy. He met cousins and connections who would later become crucial to his political career. He absorbed the manners and assumptions of the ruling class. But something else was happening as well. Peter Jefferson's library, modest by the standards of great planters, became young Thomas's refuge. He read everything he could find. He developed a hunger for knowledge that would last his entire life. Books became his passion, his escape, his way of making sense of the world. In 1757, when Thomas was 14, Peter Jefferson died. The death was sudden, probably from disease, though the records are unclear. Peter was 49 years old. He left behind a substantial estate, more than 5,000 acres divided among several properties, and approximately 60 enslaved people. His will specified that Thomas, as the eldest son, would inherit the bulk of the property when he came of age. The death of his father was the first great loss of Jefferson's life. Peter had been a strong presence, a man of action and practical competence. Thomas, by contrast, was becoming a scholar, an intellectual, someone more interested in ideas than in the physical work of surveying and managing land. The two had not been particularly close, but the loss was still profound. The will also specified that Thomas should receive a classical education. Peter had understood that education was the key to success in Virginia society. He had made his own way through skill and hard work, but he wanted his son to have the advantages he had lacked, the polish and learning that would allow Thomas to move confidently among the established gentry. So, at 14, Thomas was sent to study with James Morey, an Anglican clergyman who ran a small school for the sons of planters. For 2 years, Jefferson studied under Morey, mastering Greek and Latin, reading Virgil and Homer, absorbing the classical education that defined a gentleman. These were formative years. Maury was not just a teacher of languages, he was a thinker, someone who engaged with ideas and encouraged his students to do the same. The curriculum was rigorous. Jefferson spent hours each day studying Latin and Greek texts, translating passages from Virgil, Horace, and Homer. He read Caesar's commentaries on the Gallic Wars in the original Latin. He worked through Greek tragedies, absorbing not just the language but the ideas, the philosophy, the worldview of classical civilization. Maury's school was small, perhaps a dozen students total. They boarded at his home, living in close quarters with their teacher and his family. The days followed a strict routine: prayers at dawn, breakfast, hours of study, more prayers, dinner, evening study, bed. It was a monastic existence in many ways, designed to shape young minds through discipline and repetition. But Maury encouraged more than just memorization. He taught his students to think critically, to examine arguments, to distinguish between evidence and assumption. He had them debate each other, taking different sides of philosophical questions. He introduced them to Locke's empiricism and the idea that knowledge comes from experience rather than divine revelation. These were radical ideas in a society still dominated by Anglican orthodoxy. Jefferson thrived under this method. He discovered that he loved ideas, loved the process of logical reasoning, loved the feeling of understanding something complex and difficult. He began keeping notebooks, copying out passages from books, recording his own thoughts and observations. This habit of systematic note-taking would stay with him for life, eventually producing tens of thousands of pages of records covering everything from the weather to philosophy. But perhaps the most important relationship of these years was not with a teacher at all. Among Jefferson's fellow students was Dabney Carr, who would become his closest friend and eventually his brother-in-law. The two boys were opposites in many ways. Carr was outgoing and sociable where Jefferson was reserved. Carr was a natural public speaker where Jefferson struggled with oral expression. Carr was comfortable in his own skin where Jefferson was awkward and self-conscious. Yet they became inseparable. They would walk through the woods near Shadwell for hours, talking endlessly. They discussed the books they were reading, the ideas they were encountering, their dreams for the future. They shared the intense, all-consuming friendships that mark adolescence, when everything seems possible and the world has not yet taught you the limits of what you can be. They chose a particular spot on a mountain near Shadwell, a place they called their oak tree. It was a massive white oak on what Jefferson would later name Monticello, the Little Mountain. Under its spreading branches they made a pact. Whoever died first, the other would bury him in this spot. It was the kind of romantic, melodramatic promise that teenage boys make, never really believing they will have to keep it. The friendship with Carr was crucial for Jefferson in another way. Carr had a sister, Martha, who was close in age to Jefferson's own sister, also named Martha. The families were connected, and Jefferson would eventually marry Carr's cousin. But more than that, Carr showed Jefferson what he himself lacked: social ease, comfort with people, the ability to move through the world without constant self-consciousness. Jefferson watched Carr and learned from him. He studied how his friend spoke to others, how he made people laugh, how he navigated social situations that Jefferson found terrifying. It was a kind of education that no book could provide, and Jefferson absorbed it carefully, building the social skills that would later make him an effective politician despite his natural reticence. It was during these years that Jefferson's essential character took shape. He was brilliant but socially awkward. He loved learning but struggled with public speaking. He was ambitious but uncomfortable with direct confrontation. He could write with eloquence and clarity, but stammered when speaking extemporaneously. He was forming the habits that would define his life. The long hours of reading and note-taking, the systematic organization of knowledge, the preference for written communication over oral argument. In 1760, at age 17, Jefferson left Morey's School for the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg. It was time for the next phase of his education, time to enter the world of men, time to begin preparing for whatever role fortune had in store for him. He could not know that within 16 years he would write the words that would birth a nation. Williamsburg in 1760 was the capital of Virginia and the most sophisticated town in the colony. It was not large, perhaps 2,000 permanent residents, but during the legislative sessions when the House of Burgesses met, the population swelled with planters from across the colony, along with their enslaved servants, creating a bustling centre of politics, commerce and society. The College of William and Mary, founded in 1693, was the second oldest institution of higher learning in Britain's American colonies. It was small, with perhaps 100 students total, but it offered something Jefferson craved: access to ideas, to books, to teachers who took learning seriously. Jefferson arrived in Williamsburg a gangly 17-year-old, tall and thin, with red hair and hazel eyes. He was shy in groups, but animated in small conversations with people he trusted. He had money enough, being the son of a substantial planter, but he was not yet the master of his inheritance. He was awkward with young women, tongue-tied at dances, more comfortable in the library than the ballroom. The teacher who would most influence him was William Small, a Scotsman who taught mathematics and natural philosophy. Small was unusual in the college faculty because he was not an Anglican clergyman. He was a man of the Enlightenment, familiar with the latest scientific and philosophical developments in Europe. He taught Newton's physics and Locke's philosophy. He encouraged Jefferson to think for himself, to question authority, to trust in reason rather than tradition. Small's influence on Jefferson cannot be overstated. Here was a teacher who treated him as an intellectual equal, who engaged him in serious conversation about ideas, who respected his curiosity and encouraged his questions. Small introduced Jefferson to the scientific method, to the idea that natural phenomena could be understood through observation and reason rather than accepted on faith or authority. They would walk together in the evenings, discussing mathematics, astronomy, natural history. Small lent Jefferson books from his personal library, works that were not part of the standard curriculum, but that represented the cutting edge of European thought. Jefferson read Bacon on experimental science, Locke on human understanding, Newton on the mathematical principles governing the physical world. Under Small's tutelage, Jefferson began to see the world differently. Nature was not chaotic or mysterious, but ordered by laws that could be discovered and expressed mathematically. Human society, similarly, could be understood rationally, its problems solved through the application of reason and observation. This was the Enlightenment worldview in its purest form, and Jefferson absorbed it completely. Small introduced Jefferson to two other men who would complete his education. George Wythe was Williamsburg's most respected lawyer, a man of immense learning and impeccable integrity. Wythe was largely self-taught, having educated himself through voracious reading when formal education was denied him. He had built himself into one of Virginia's leading legal minds through sheer determination and intellectual discipline. He saw in young Jefferson a similar hunger for knowledge and took him under his protection. Francis Fauquier was the royal governor of Virginia, representing King George III in the colony. But unlike many royal appointees, Fauquier was a man of genuine culture and learning. He'd been educated at Cambridge, had travelled widely in Europe, and brought to Virginia a sophistication rare in the provinces. He loved music, philosophy, and good conversation. He hosted regular dinner parties where the finest minds in Williamsburg gathered to discuss ideas. Jefferson at 18 found himself invited to these gatherings. It was an extraordinary privilege for an undergraduate. He sat at table with the governor of the colony, William Small, George Wythe, and occasionally other prominent visitors passing through Williamsburg. The conversation ranged across every topic: the latest developments in European science, philosophical debates about human nature and government, the practical politics of managing a colony, the aesthetic merits of different architectural styles. These dinners were Jefferson's real education. He learned to converse with learned men as an equal. He absorbed not just knowledge, but a way of being in the world, a confidence that came from intellectual engagement with important ideas. He learned when to speak and when to listen, when to assert an opinion and when to defer to greater knowledge. He discovered that despite his poor public speaking abilities, he could hold his own in small group conversations, especially when given time to think through his arguments. The discussions at Fauquier's table also gave Jefferson his first sustained exposure to political philosophy. They discussed Locke's theories about natural rights and the social contract, Montesquieu's ideas about separation of powers, the various forms of government and their relative merits. These were not abstract academic exercises. These were practical questions about how society should be organized, questions that would become urgent and immediate within just a few years. But Williamsburg offered more than intellectual stimulation. It was also Jefferson's introduction to the machinery of colonial politics. The House of Burgesses met in the Capitol building, a short walk from the college. When the assembly was in session, Williamsburg filled with planters from across the colony, come to conduct the business of government. Jefferson attended sessions, watching from the gallery as Virginia's gentry debated laws, negotiated compromises, and conducted the practical work of governing. He saw how power actually functioned, how interest competed, how the machinery of legislation really worked. He observed the dynamic between the royal governor, representing the crown, and the elected burgesses, representing Virginia's interests. He began to understand that government was not just abstract theory, but a complex system of competing forces that had to be balanced and managed. He also fell in love, or thought he did. Her name was Rebecca Burwell, 16 years old, dark-haired and pretty. Jefferson was completely smitten, but utterly incapable of expressing his feelings effectively. He would see her at dances and social gatherings and find himself tongue-tied, unable to speak the eloquent phrases he had carefully prepared. He wrote letters to friends about her, using a code name, Belinda, describing his frustrated attempts at courtship. He planned elaborate strategies for how he would declare his affection, scripting conversations in his mind that never went as planned when he actually tried to have them. His friends found the whole thing alternately amusing and painful to watch. Here was this brilliant young man, capable of discussing philosophy and science with the colony's leading minds, reduced to stammering incompetence by a teenage girl. Finally, at a dance in the Apollo room of the Raleigh Tavern, Jefferson worked up his courage. He approached Rebecca with the intention of proposing marriage, or at least declaring his interest. The conversation was a disaster. He stumbled over his words, lost his train of thought, and ended up saying nothing of consequence. Rebecca, whether out of kindness or genuine confusion, smiled politely and moved on. A few months later, she became engaged to someone else. Jefferson was devastated, though he hid his feelings behind studied indifference. He wrote to a friend that he had never been really attached to her, that the whole thing had been a minor amusement. No one who knew him believed this performance, but it became a pattern. Jefferson's emotions running deep but hidden, his passions concealed beneath a surface of rational control. In 1762, after 2 years at William and Mary, Jefferson completed his formal education. He had studied mathematics, philosophy, classical languages, and natural history, but he was not yet ready to return to Shadwell and life as a planter. He wanted a profession, something that would distinguish him beyond simply owning land and enslaved people. He chose law, and he chose George Wythe as his teacher. Legal training in Colonial Virginia did not involve law school. It involved apprenticeship, reading law in an established attorney's office, copying documents, studying cases, absorbing the practical knowledge of the profession. Jefferson threw himself into this work with characteristic intensity. For 5 years, from 1762 to 1767, he studied law under Withey's direction. He read constantly, taking extensive notes, filling commonplace books with excerpts and observations. He studied not just English law, but the philosophical foundations of law itself. He read Coke and Blackstone, but also Locke and Montesquieu. He was interested in why laws worked, what made them just, how legal systems reflected and shaped society. During these years, Jefferson began developing the habits that would define his adult life. He kept detailed records of everything, recording expenditures, noting the first appearance of flowers in spring, tracking the weather, cataloguing his reading. He designed and redesigned the house he planned to build at Shadwell, sketching floor plans and elevations, imagining the library where his growing collection of books would live, and he continued to own enslaved people. His father's estate had been divided among his siblings, but Thomas received the largest share, including approximately 52 enslaved individuals. He hired them out, sold some, bought others, managing human property with the same systematic attention he brought to everything else. The records show purchases of enslaved children, sales of enslaved families, the routine transactions of a slave-owning society that Jefferson participated in without apparent moral qualm. In 1767, Jefferson was admitted to the Virginia bar. He began practicing law, taking cases throughout the colony. He was not a gifted courtroom lawyer. His weak-speaking voice and tendency to prepare written arguments rather than improvise made him better suited to appellate work than jury trials. But he was thorough, learned, and conscientious, and he built a respectable practice. He was also becoming a planter in earnest. In 1768, he began construction on Monticello, the house that would become his life's work. He chose a site on the mountain near Shadwell where he and Dabney Carr had made their boyhood pact. He designed the house himself, drawing on classical architecture and his own aesthetic vision. It would take decades to complete, and he would never entirely finish it, constantly redesigning and rebuilding as his ideas evolved. And in 1769, at age 26, Jefferson entered politics. He was elected to the House of Burgesses, representing Albemarle County. It was the beginning of a political career that would span 4 decades and reshape a continent. But first, the tensions between Britain and its American colonies, simmering for years, were about to explode into something that would demand everything Jefferson had learned and force him to articulate ideals that would change the world. The House of Burgesses met in the Capitol building in Williamsburg, an elegant brick structure that housed both the legislature and the colonial courts. When Jefferson took his seat in May 1769, he joined an assembly of Virginia's leading men. Here were the great planters and established families, the Lees and Randolphs, the Pendletons and Harrisons, men who had governed Virginia for generations. The newest member from Albemarle County did not make a dramatic impression. Jefferson rarely spoke in debate, his weak voice and discomfort with extemporaneous speaking making him ineffective on the floor. But he listened carefully, took notes, and began to understand the mechanics of legislative politics. What he witnessed in his first session was a direct confrontation with royal authority. The Burgesses passed resolutions asserting Virginia's exclusive right to tax Virginians, a direct challenge to Parliament's claim that it could levy taxes on the colonies. The royal governor responded by dissolving the assembly, ending the session, and sending the Burgesses home. It was Jefferson's first experience of the constitutional crisis that was tearing apart the British Empire. For more than a decade, tensions had been building between Britain and its American colonies. The question at stake was deceptively simple. Who had ultimate authority over the colonies? Parliament in London, or the colonial assemblies elected by colonists? The British position was that Parliament was supreme, that it could legislate for the colonies in all matters, including taxation. The colonial position was that they could be taxed only by their own elected representatives. Since they did not elect members of Parliament, Parliament could not tax them. This was not rebellion, the colonists insisted. This was defending the traditional rights of Englishmen, rights guaranteed by centuries of constitutional development. The conflict intensified through the early 1760s. The Boston Massacre in 1770, the burning of the British custom ship Gaspee in 1772, the Boston Tea Party in 1773. Each incident pushed the two sides further apart. Parliament responded to colonial resistance with increasingly harsh measures. The colonies responded by forming committees of correspondence to coordinate their resistance. Jefferson watched these developments with growing alarm. He wrote pamphlets arguing Virginia's constitutional position. He served on committees drafting responses to British actions. He became associated with the more radical faction of the Burgesses, the men like Patrick Henry and Richard Henry Lee, who were willing to push confrontation further than the conservative planters thought wise. But Jefferson's attention was not solely focused on politics. In 1770, the house at Shadwell burned to the ground. Jefferson was not there when it happened. He was away on legal business. When he returned, he found the house destroyed and with it most of his possessions, including his books. The loss of his library devastated him more than the loss of the house itself. He immediately began acquiring new books, spending money he could not afford to rebuild his collection. The fire accelerated his plans for Monticello. With Shadwell gone, he moved into the only completed portion of his new house, a small outbuilding that would serve as his home while the main structure was built. He lived there in relative isolation, surrounded by construction, spending his evenings reading and designing the house that would eventually rise around him. And in 1772, he married. Martha Wales Skelton was a widow, 23 years old, the daughter of a wealthy planter named John Wales. She was accomplished, playing the harpsichord and singing, educated by the standards of the time for elite women. She was also, like virtually every woman in her social class, a slave owner, having inherited enslaved people from her first husband. The marriage was, by all accounts, a love match. Jefferson was genuinely devoted to Martha. They shared musical interests. Jefferson played the violin, and they would perform together in the evenings. She managed the household at Monticello with competence and grace. Over the next 10 years she would bear him 6 children, though only 2 would survive to adulthood. The marriage also made Jefferson considerably wealthier, at least on paper. When John Wales died in 1773, Martha inherited a substantial portion of his estate. This included 11,000 acres of land and 135 enslaved people. It also included massive debts that Wales had accumulated, debts that Jefferson would struggle with for the rest of his life. Among the enslaved people Jefferson acquired through this inheritance was a young woman named Sally Hemings. She was Martha's half-sister, the daughter of John Wales and an enslaved woman named Betty Hemings. Sally was an infant when she became Jefferson's property. She would remain enslaved to him for the rest of his life, and the relationship that would develop between them would become one of the most controversial aspects of Jefferson's legacy. But in 1773, these future complications were invisible. Jefferson was a prosperous planter, happily married, building his dream house, pursuing his legal career, and playing an increasingly important role in Virginia's resistance to British authority. The political crisis was approaching its breaking point, and Jefferson would find himself called upon to give voice to the ideals that had been forming in his mind for years. In 1774, Virginia's response to the intolerable acts, Parliament's harsh punishment of Massachusetts for the Boston Tea Party, needed to be formulated. Jefferson drafted a paper laying out Virginia's constitutional position. The document, later published as a summary view of the rights of British America, went further than most colonial leaders were prepared to go. Jefferson argued that the colonists had voluntarily chosen to be governed by the British king, but that Parliament had no legitimate authority over them at all. The Burgesses thought the argument too radical and declined to adopt it officially. But the document was published and widely read. It established Jefferson's reputation as a writer of exceptional clarity and force. When the crisis finally erupted into war, when independence needed to be declared, the Continental Congress would know who to ask to draft the words. The Second Continental Congress met in Philadelphia in May 1775. Fighting had already broken out at Lexington and Concord the previous month. British troops and Massachusetts militia had shed blood. The careful constitutional arguments about the limits of parliamentary authority were becoming irrelevant. The question now was not whether Parliament could tax the colonies, but whether armed resistance to British authority could be justified. Jefferson arrived as one of Virginia's delegates. He was 32 years old, tall and thin, with reddish hair now tied back in the fashion of the day. He dressed elegantly but said little in debate. The Congress was full of talkers, men who could hold the floor for hours, swaying others with eloquence and passion. John Adams of Massachusetts, Patrick Henry of Virginia, these were the orators who dominated discussion. Jefferson contributed in a different way. He served on committees. He drafted documents. His facility with words, his ability to transform complex arguments into clear, memorable prose, made him valuable even if he rarely spoke aloud. When the Congress needed something written, Jefferson was often asked to do it. Through 1775 and into 1776, the Congress debated its options. Some delegates still hoped for reconciliation with Britain. Others were moving toward the conclusion that independence was the only path forward. Events kept pushing them in that direction. King George III declared the colonies in rebellion. Britain sent more troops. The fighting spread from Massachusetts to other colonies. In Virginia, Jefferson's personal life was becoming complicated. Martha was pregnant again and unwell. Jefferson wanted to be home with her, but his duties in Philadelphia kept him away. He wrote anxious letters asking about her health. He made trips back to Monticello when he could, riding hard to cover the distance, staying as long as possible before duty called him back to Philadelphia. Meanwhile, Dabney Carr, his closest friend and brother-in-law, had died suddenly in 1773 at age 30. Jefferson had buried him under the great oak at Monticello, honouring the pact they had made as boys. The loss had shaken him. Death was a constant presence in the 18th century, but each loss still struck hard. By the spring of 1776, the political situation had reached a crisis point. More and more delegates were concluding that independence was inevitable. In June, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia introduced a resolution that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. The Congress debated the resolution, but before voting on it, they appointed a committee to draft a declaration explaining and justifying such independence. The committee consisted of 5 men: John Adams of Massachusetts, Benjamin Franklin of Pennsylvania, Roger Sherman of Connecticut, Robert Livingston of New York, and Thomas Jefferson of Virginia. Among them, Jefferson was chosen to write the first draft. He was 33 years old. He'd been a public figure for less than a decade, and he was about to write the most famous sentences in American history. Jefferson worked on the document in the rented rooms where he was staying in Philadelphia. He had few books with him, but he did not need them. The ideas he was expressing had been forming for years, shaped by his reading of Locke and other Enlightenment thinkers, refined through years of debate about colonial rights, distilled into the essential argument for why revolution could be justified. He wrote quickly, covering page after page in his clear flowing hand. He made few corrections as he went, suggesting that the ideas and even the phrases had been well worked out in his mind before he put pen to paper. The document he produced had 3 parts: a philosophical preamble, laying out general principles, a long list of specific grievances against King George III, and a formal declaration of independence. It was the preamble that would echo through history. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. These were not entirely original ideas. Jefferson was synthesizing concepts that had been circulating in Enlightenment thought for decades. The notion that people had natural rights that preceded government, that governments existed to protect those rights, that governments derived their legitimacy from popular consent. All of this came from Locke and other philosophers Jefferson had studied. But Jefferson's achievement was to state these ideas with a clarity and force that made them seem not just arguable, but self-evident. He was not making a complex philosophical argument. He was declaring truths so basic that no rational person could deny them. It was a rhetorical masterstroke, transforming contested political philosophy into fundamental reality. The committee made minor changes. Franklin suggested a few word choices. Adams offered small edits. Then the document went to the full Congress for debate. For 3 days, the delegates went through the draft line by line, cutting, revising, arguing over every phrase. Jefferson sat in silence, watching as they altered his prose. He was deeply attached to his exact wording, and every change felt like an assault on the document's perfection. The most significant change was the deletion of an entire section. Jefferson had included a long passage condemning the slave trade, blaming King George III for forcing slavery on the colonies. It was historical nonsense. The colonies had eagerly participated in and profited from slavery. But more than that, it was politically impossible. Southern delegates and some northern ones refused to accept it. The passage was struck out. On July 4th, 1776, the Continental Congress voted to adopt the Declaration of Independence. 12 colonies voted yes. New York abstained but would approve soon after. The document was sent to the printer. Copies were dispatched to the state assemblies and to the army. It was read aloud in public squares. It was posted on tavern walls. And with those words, 13 British colonies became something else entirely: the United States of America. Jefferson had written the birth certificate of a nation. The words would be quoted in revolutionary movements across the globe. They would be invoked by abolitionists fighting slavery, by suffragettes demanding the vote for women, by civil rights leaders fighting segregation, by liberation movements from South America to Southeast Asia. More than any battle, more than any law, those words would be Jefferson's lasting contribution to human history. But there was a terrible irony at the heart of it all, one that Jefferson himself must have recognized even if he never fully confronted it. He wrote that all men are created equal while owning more than 100 enslaved human beings. He proclaimed the unalienable right to liberty while denying liberty to people he claimed as property. He declared that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed while governing people who had never consented, who had no power to consent, who were governed absolutely by his will alone. How did he reconcile this? The answer appears to be that he didn't, not really. He convinced himself that slavery was evil, but that ending it was impossible in his lifetime. He believed that future generations would solve the problem. He thought that by articulating the principles of human equality and natural rights, he was planting the seeds of slavery's eventual destruction. He was aware of the contradiction, but chose to live with it, a compromise that allowed him to maintain both his ideals and his way of life. The Declaration was signed. The revolution begun. Jefferson returned to Virginia, to Martha and Monticello, to serve in Virginia's new state government. The war would rage for years. The outcome was far from certain, and Jefferson's greatest work, in his own mind at least, still lay ahead. Jefferson did not fight in the Revolutionary War. He was not a military man, never served in the Continental Army, never commanded troops or participated in battle. His contribution to independence was made with pen and paper, in legislative chambers and at writing desks. But the war consumed 8 years of his life nonetheless, and the conflict that was being fought across America would test him in ways he had not anticipated. After drafting the Declaration, Jefferson returned to Virginia and devoted himself to rebuilding the state's legal system. The revolution, he believed, needed to be about more than simply replacing British rulers with American ones. It needed to fundamentally transform society, to create laws and institutions that reflected the principles he had articulated in the Declaration. He served in Virginia's House of Delegates and drafted an astonishing number of bills aimed at restructuring Virginia society. He proposed abolishing primogeniture and entail, the laws that kept great estates intact across generations. He drafted a bill establishing religious freedom, arguing that the state had no business dictating religious belief. He proposed a comprehensive system of public education, free for all white boys. He revised Virginia's entire legal code, attempting to make it more rational and humane. Some of these reforms passed, though often in modified form. Others failed entirely. The resistance from established interests was fierce. Planters who benefited from primogeniture fought its abolition. The Anglican Church establishment resisted disestablishment. The education bill failed because taxpayers refused to fund schools for other people's children. But Jefferson kept working, driven by the conviction that legal reform was as important as military victory. The revolution, in his view, was about creating a new kind of society, one based on reason and merit, rather than inherited privilege. Then, in 1779, the Virginia legislature elected him governor. It was a position he had not sought, but once elected he accepted the duty. It would prove to be one of the most difficult experiences of his life. Virginia's governorship in wartime was almost an impossible job. The state was under constant threat from British forces. The governor had limited powers and few resources. The legislature jealously guarded its authority and was reluctant to grant the governor the emergency powers that military necessity demanded. Jefferson found himself trying to coordinate a war effort with inadequate troops, insufficient supplies, and an uncooperative legislature. In his first year as governor, things were manageable, but in 1780 the British shifted their military strategy, focusing on conquering the southern states. Virginia became a primary target. British forces under Lord Cornwallis invaded from the south. Benedict Arnold, the American traitor, led British raiders up the James River. The state militia was poorly equipped and unreliable. Many men simply went home when their short enlistments expired. In January 1781, Arnold's forces approached Richmond, the new capital. Jefferson, with almost no military force to oppose them, could only watch as the British marched in and burned government buildings. He evacuated the government to Charlottesville, but even there safety was temporary. In June 1781, British cavalry under Colonel Banastre Tarleton made a sudden raid on Charlottesville, hoping to capture Jefferson and the legislature. Jefferson was at Monticello, just a few miles from Charlottesville. He received warning just in time to escape. He packed Martha and the children into a carriage, sent them to safety, and then fled on horseback himself. The British arrived at Monticello within minutes of his departure. They occupied his house but did not burn it, a courtesy that Tarleton extended, though he would not have extended it to Jefferson personally if he'd caught him. The image of Jefferson fleeing on horseback from British cavalry became a source of humiliation. His political enemies would later accuse him of cowardice, of abandoning his post, of running away while braver men faced the enemy. The charges were unfair. Staying at Monticello would have accomplished nothing except his capture. But fair or not, the accusations stung. Jefferson's term as governor ended just as this crisis peaked. He was eligible for re-election but chose not to seek another term. He was exhausted, demoralized, and convinced that he had failed. The legislature launched an inquiry into his conduct as governor, investigating whether he'd been derelict in his duties. The inquiry eventually exonerated him, but the experience left deep scars. He retreated to Monticello, determined to retire from public life permanently. He was 38 years old. He had served in the Continental Congress, drafted the Declaration of Independence, reformed Virginia's laws, and served 2 terms as governor during the most dangerous period of the war. He had done enough, he believed. He wanted nothing more than to live quietly at Monticello with Martha and their children, tending his farms, reading his books, building his house. But fate would not allow such a simple ending. and before Jefferson could find the peace he sought, he would face the greatest personal tragedy of his life. Martha Jefferson had never been strong. The constant round of pregnancies had worn her down. She'd given birth 6 times in 10 years. 2 children had died in infancy. 2 more, girls named Jane and Mary, survived. A son, another infant, would be born in 1781 and live only a few weeks, and in 1782 Martha was pregnant again. Jefferson watched helplessly as his wife's health deteriorated. She was often bedridden. She suffered from what the 18th century called nervous disorders, probably a combination of physical exhaustion and what we would now recognise as depression. The pregnancy in 1782 was particularly difficult. In May 1782, Martha gave birth to a daughter. The baby, named Lucy Elizabeth, was healthy. But Martha never recovered from the delivery. She grew weaker. The doctors could do nothing. 18th century medicine had no treatments for what we would now identify as complications from childbirth, possibly an infection or hemorrhage. For 4 months, Jefferson hardly left her bedside. He nursed her himself, reading to her, trying to keep her spirits up, hoping against all evidence that she would somehow recover. He filled the long hours by copying and recopying her favourite poetry. She was conscious enough to know she was dying, and Jefferson, watching her fade, was being destroyed. On September 6, 1782, Martha Jefferson died. She was 33 years old. She'd been married to Jefferson for 10 years. According to the accounts that survived, Jefferson fainted when she died and remained unconscious for so long that his family feared for his sanity. For weeks after her death, Jefferson locked himself in his room. He saw no one except his daughters. He paced the floors at night. His sister and daughters heard him walking endlessly through the darkened house. When he finally emerged, he was haggard, aged, broken. He could not bear to stay at Monticello. Every room reminded him of Martha. He began taking long solitary rides through the mountains, sometimes gone for hours. His family worried that he would injure himself or simply not return. His daughter Martha, who was 10 years old, later recalled watching her father in those months, seeing him consumed by grief in a way that frightened her. Friends intervened, concerned that Jefferson was sinking into a depression from which he might never emerge. James Madison, his close political ally, suggested that the best cure for grief was occupation, something to force Jefferson out of himself. Congress was about to send commissioners to Paris to negotiate peace treaties with European powers. Jefferson was offered a position. He accepted. In December 1782, 3 months after Martha's death, Jefferson left Monticello for Philadelphia, intending to sail for France. But ice in the Chesapeake delayed his departure, and before he could leave, word arrived that a preliminary peace treaty had been signed. The commission was dissolved. Jefferson returned to Monticello, once again facing empty days with nothing to fill them but grief. Then, in June 1783, Congress appointed him to represent Virginia once more. The war was over. The Treaty of Paris, formally ending the conflict and recognizing American independence, was being finalized. Congress needed men to help establish the new nation's government. Jefferson accepted, taking his daughter Martha with him. He could not bring himself to leave her behind, could not separate himself from the last living remnants of the life he had shared with his wife. For the next year, Jefferson served in Congress, helping to establish the basic framework of the American government under the Articles of Confederation. He drafted the ordinance that would eventually become the Northwest Ordinance, establishing how Western territories would be governed and eventually admitted as states. He proposed that slavery be banned in all Western territories, a proposal that failed by a single vote. one of history's tragic near misses. But he was still adrift emotionally, still grieving, still unable to imagine a future that held any meaning. And then in 1784, Congress offered him an escape. He was appointed to join Benjamin Franklin and John Adams in Paris as a commissioner to negotiate commercial treaties with European powers. France meant distance from Monticello and its memories. It meant occupation, diplomatic duties that would fill his days. It meant a chance to see the wider world he had only read about. Jefferson accepted immediately. In July 1784, Jefferson sailed for France, taking his daughter Martha with him. He also brought James Hemings, an enslaved young man who was Martha Jefferson's half-brother. James would be trained as a chef in Paris, learning French cooking techniques, and eventually Jefferson would send for his younger daughter Mary and her companion Mary's, enslaved attendant Sally Hemings, James's younger sister. The ship crossed the Atlantic in 19 days. Jefferson was leaving behind Virginia, Monticello, and a life that had brought him both his greatest joys and his deepest sorrows. What he would find in Paris would change him in ways he could not predict, exposing him to ideas and experiences that would reshape his understanding of the world. But he would never truly escape Virginia. He would never stop being a Virginia planter, never fully abandon the assumptions and prejudices of his class, never resolve the contradictions that defined him. The years in Paris would give him a broader perspective, but they would not make him a different man. Paris in 1784 was the cultural and intellectual capital of Europe. It was a city of 500,000 people, more than 50 times the size of Philadelphia. It was sophisticated, cosmopolitan, elegant, and corrupt. The French monarchy still ruled absolutely, but the society over which it presided was changing, stirring with the ideas that would soon explode into revolution. Jefferson arrived as an ambassador of a new nation that most Europeans regarded with curiosity and some skepticism. The United States had won its independence, but remained weak, disorganized, and unclear about its future. European powers were willing to negotiate with the Americans, but they did not take the new republic particularly seriously. They viewed it much as they might view any minor power on the periphery of their concerns, potentially useful but not particularly important. Jefferson's job was to negotiate commercial treaties and to represent American interests at the French court. He worked alongside Benjamin Franklin, who was already enormously popular in Paris, treated as a sage and philosopher by French society. The French loved Franklin's wit, his simplicity of dress, his democratic manners. They saw in him an embodiment of American virtue, rustic wisdom uncontaminated by European corruption. John Adams was also in Paris initially, before being posted to London as minister to Britain. Adam was perpetually irritated by French manners and morals. He found French society frivolous, their religion hollow, their political system absurd. The three men made an odd team, but they worked effectively enough, negotiating treaties and trying to establish America's diplomatic credibility. Jefferson rented a house on the Champs-Élysées, then a relatively new development on the western edge of Paris. The house was elegant, with high ceilings and large windows, far grander than anything he had lived in before. He furnished it with items purchased from Parisian shops, spending money he did not have to create a setting appropriate for an ambassador. He brought with him James Hemings, the enslaved young man who was Martha Jefferson's half-brother. James was in his early 20s, light-skinned, intelligent, and Jefferson had brought him to Paris specifically to be trained as a chef. Jefferson arranged for James to apprentice with French master chefs, learning the elaborate techniques of French cuisine. It was an unusual investment in an enslaved person's education, motivated partly by Jefferson's love of fine food, and partly perhaps by some sense of obligation to his late wife's family. Jefferson threw himself into Parisian society with an enthusiasm he had rarely shown in social situations before. He attended salons where intellectuals and aristocrats gathered to discuss philosophy, science, and politics. These were not formal academic settings, but social gatherings, usually hosted by women of the aristocracy, where wit and conversation were prized above all else. At the salon of Madame Helvétius, the widow of a famous philosopher, Jefferson met the leading thinkers of the French Enlightenment. Condorcet, the mathematician and philosopher who believed in inevitable human progress through reason and science. The Marquis de Lafayette, who had fought in the American Revolution and had become Jefferson's friend. The physiocrats, economists who argued that agriculture was the source of all true wealth, an idea that appealed strongly to Jefferson's prejudices. He visited the Royal Academy of Sciences and met with French naturalists. He engaged in a long correspondence with the Comte de Buffon, defending American nature against European claims that the New World's climate produced inferior plants and animals. Buffon had argued in his influential Natural History that American species were smaller and weaker than their European counterparts, that even Europeans who settled in America would degenerate physically. Jefferson took this as a personal insult and spent considerable effort assembling evidence to refute it, including shipping a stuffed moose to Paris to demonstrate the size and vigour of American fauna. He toured gardens and studied architecture with obsessive attention to detail. He visited the Hôtel de Salm, a recently completed mansion, repeatedly, studying its proportions and design features. He examined the Maison Carrée in Nîmes, a Roman temple that became his model for the Virginia state capital, which he was designing from Paris. He sketched buildings, measured proportions, took notes on construction techniques. He haunted bookshops, buying volumes to add to his growing library. He purchased books on architecture, agriculture, natural history, philosophy, politics, literature. He bought mathematical instruments, scientific equipment, engravings, and maps. He was acquiring the material culture of learning, surrounding himself with the physical objects that represented knowledge and refinement. He also bought wines, many wines. He toured the wine regions of France and parts of Italy, tasting, comparing, making detailed notes about which vineyards produced the finest vintages. He arranged to have wines shipped to America, both for his own cellars and as gifts for friends. This was not frivolous indulgence. Wine was for Jefferson a subject of serious study, part of his larger project of understanding agriculture and bringing European cultivation techniques to America. But all of this acquisition came at a terrible cost. Jefferson was living far beyond his means, spending money he did not have and would never be able to repay. He was a Virginia planter trying to live like a Parisian gentleman, and the expenses were ruinous. He was already deep in debt from his father-in-law's obligations, and his time in Paris would deepen that debt considerably. The bills would haunt him for the rest of his life. In 1785, Franklin returned to America, and Jefferson succeeded him as the American minister to France. It was a significant promotion, making Jefferson the primary representative of the United States to one of the world's great powers. He took the responsibility seriously, working to expand trade between America and France, to secure loans for the struggling American government, and to navigate the complex diplomatic landscape of European power politics. The work was often frustrating. France's finances were in disarray. The government was sympathetic to America, but unable to provide the kind of support the new nation desperately needed. The commercial treaties Jefferson negotiated were often more symbolic than substantial. American trade was simply too small to matter much to European powers focused on their own conflicts and interests. But Paris affected Jefferson in more personal ways as well. He had lived his entire life in Virginia, where society was provincial and isolated. Paris showed him a different world, one where ideas flowed freely, where women participated in intellectual life on terms of equality with men, where art and culture were valued as highly as land and tobacco, where conversation itself was considered an art form worthy of cultivation. He struggled with what he saw. He loved the sophistication and learning, the beauty of the architecture, the quality of the wine and food, the intellectual stimulation of the salons. But he was also disturbed by the poverty he witnessed, by the vast gulf between the aristocracy and the common people, by what he saw as the moral corruption of a society built on inherited privilege and royal absolutism. He walked through the streets of Paris and saw beggars, saw emaciated children, saw desperate poverty of a kind and scale he had never encountered in Virginia. The contrast between the opulent wealth of the aristocracy and the grinding poverty of the masses shocked him. This was what happened, he concluded, when land became concentrated in the hands of a few, when cities grew too large, when people lost their connection to agriculture and became dependent on others for their survival. He began to articulate a vision of what America should be, defined in contrast to what he saw in Europe. America should remain agricultural, he believed, a nation of independent farmers who owned their own land and governed themselves. Cities bred corruption and dependence. Manufactures created classes of workers dependent on factory owners, no better than the impoverished masses he saw in European capitals. The European model, with its cities and industries and sharp class divisions, was precisely what America needed to avoid. It was a vision that would shape his political philosophy for the rest of his life, but it was also a vision built on a massive contradiction. Jefferson's ideal of independent farmers presupposed a vast supply of land. In Europe, land was scarce and expensive. In America, it seemed infinite. But that infinity was an illusion based on ignoring the people who already lived on the land, the indigenous nations who would have to be dispossessed to create Jefferson's Republic of Farmers. And Jefferson's vision of independent farmers also required ignoring the enslaved labor that made Virginia agriculture profitable, the unfree workers whose bondage made possible the independence of their owners. But these contradictions would become fully apparent only later. In Paris, Jefferson was still forming his ideas, still absorbing influences, still becoming the thinker and politician he would be. It was during these Paris years that Jefferson encountered a woman who would fascinate biographers for centuries. Maria Cosway was the wife of a British painter. She was beautiful, accomplished, unhappily married, and she and Jefferson began what appeared to be a romantic relationship, though whether it was ever consummated remains unknown and debated. They took long walks together. They visited galleries and gardens. They corresponded extensively, Jefferson writing in a style far more emotional and revealing than his usual careful prose. In one famous letter, he presented a dialogue between his head and his heart, with his heart arguing for the joys of love and his head warning against the pain it brings. The relationship could not last. Maria returned to England. Jefferson was left with memories and regrets. He would never remarry, never form another acknowledged romantic attachment after Martha's death. Whatever his personal feelings, he kept them locked away, revealed only in occasional letters and private moments. And then in 1787, Jefferson sent for his youngest daughter, Mary, who had been living with relatives in Virginia. Mary, who was 8 or 9 years old, sailed to France accompanied by an enslaved teenager named Sally Hemings. Sally was the daughter of Betty Hemings and John Wales, making her the half-sister of Jefferson's late wife. She was probably 14 years old when she arrived in Paris. She was, by the accounts that survive, light-skinned and attractive, and at some point during the 5 years that Jefferson remained in Paris, a relationship began between them. The details are murky. Jefferson never acknowledged the relationship publicly. Sally never wrote or spoke about it in any document that survived. But the evidence, both from contemporary accounts and from DNA testing conducted 2 centuries later, strongly suggests that Jefferson fathered at least some, and probably all, of Sally Hemings' 6 children. The relationship would have been illegal in Virginia, where sexual relations between whites and blacks were forbidden by law. It was certainly exploitative. Sally was enslaved, owned by Jefferson, without power to refuse him or to leave. The profound imbalance of power makes any notion of consent meaningless. Whatever emotions may have existed on either side, the fundamental reality was that of owner and property. Jefferson's defenders have attempted for 200 years to deny that the relationship existed at all, but the evidence has become overwhelming. What remains is the question of what it means for Jefferson's legacy, how we reconcile the author of the Declaration with a man who owned his children, who enslaved his lover, who sold some of his own offspring to pay his debts. There are no easy answers. Jefferson lived with contradictions his entire life, and this was perhaps the deepest and most personal one. In 1789, the political situation in France began to deteriorate rapidly. The financial crisis that had been building for years finally reached a breaking point. The king called the Estates General, an assembly that had not met in more than a century. The Third Estate, representing commoners, declared itself the National Assembly. The Bastille was stormed. The French Revolution had begun. Jefferson watched with excitement and some alarm. He sympathized with the revolutionaries' goals but worried about their methods. He advised moderate French aristocrats on constitutional reform, drawing on American experience. He witnessed the early stages of a revolution that would become far more radical and violent than America's. In September 1789, Jefferson received word that Washington had appointed him Secretary of State. It was time to go home. He had been in France for 5 years. He packed his belongings, including the many objects he'd acquired, said goodbye to friends and colleagues, and sailed for America. He brought with him his 2 daughters and 2 enslaved people, James and Sally Hemings. In France, they had been legally free. French law did not recognize slavery. But they returned with Jefferson to Virginia, to slavery, though James would later negotiate his freedom in exchange for training another enslaved person to cook. Jefferson believed he was returning to Monticello, to retirement, to the life of a gentleman farmer he had always desired. He had no idea that the next decade would plunge him into the most vicious political conflicts of his life, or that he would spend 8 years as president of a nation that was still defining what it meant to exist. When Jefferson returned to America in November 1789, the Constitution had been ratified, and George Washington was president. The new federal government was just beginning to function, and the country faced fundamental questions about what kind of nation it would become. Jefferson accepted the position of Secretary of State with some reluctance. He had hoped to return to private life, but Washington's request was difficult to refuse. He arrived in New York, then the temporary capital, in March 1790, and immediately found himself in the middle of conflicts that would define American politics for a generation. The central divide was between 2 visions of America's future. Alexander Hamilton, the Secretary of the Treasury, envisioned a commercial and industrial nation with a strong federal government, a central bank, funded debt, and close ties to Britain. Jefferson, by contrast, wanted an agricultural nation of independent farmers, with power reserved to the states, minimal government, and friendship with France. The conflict between Hamilton and Jefferson became intensely personal. Each man believed the other was destroying the republic they had fought to create. Hamilton thought Jefferson was a dangerous radical who would reduce America to weakness and chaos. Jefferson thought Hamilton was a monarchist who wanted to recreate British-style aristocracy in America. The battles played out over specific policies. Hamilton proposed that the federal government assume the state's Revolutionary War debts, creating a funded national debt. Jefferson opposed this, seeing it as a scheme to enrich speculators and concentrate power in the federal government. Hamilton proposed creating a national bank. Jefferson argued it was unconstitutional, that the Constitution did not grant the federal government power to charter banks. Hamilton supported close commercial relations with Britain. Jefferson wanted to align with France, America's revolutionary ally. Jefferson lost most of these battles. Hamilton had Washington's support, and Hamilton's financial programs were enacted. But Jefferson succeeded in building a political opposition. Working with James Madison, he helped create what would become the Democratic Republican Party, the first organized political party in America. The partisan divide grew toxic. Newspapers allied with each faction attacked the other side with vicious personal invective. Hamilton supporters accused Jefferson of cowardice during the war, of atheism, of being a French radical. Jefferson supporters accused Hamilton of monarchism, corruption, and sexual impropriety. Washington, trying to hold his government together, became increasingly frustrated with both men. By 1793, Jefferson had had enough. He resigned as Secretary of State and returned to Monticello, convinced that he was done with politics forever. He was 50 years old. He had served his country in multiple capacities for more than 2 decades. He wanted nothing more than to spend his remaining years as a farmer, architect, and scientist. He threw himself into agricultural experiments, trying new crops and new methods of cultivation. He redesigned and rebuilt Monticello yet again, expanding the house, adding a dome, creating the architectural masterpiece that still stands today. He catalogued his library, now grown to thousands of volumes. He invented a new kind of plough. He corresponded with scientists and philosophers across America and Europe, but he could not stay retired. In 1796, the Federalists and Democratic Republicans each nominated a candidate for president. The Federalists supported John Adams. The Democratic Republicans supported Jefferson. Under the electoral system then in place, the person with the most electoral votes became president, and the person with the second most became vice president. Adams won barely. Jefferson became vice president, an awkward position given the partisan divide. The two men had once been friends, collaborators during the Revolution, but the political battles of the 1790s had strained their relationship nearly to breaking. As vice, President Jefferson had almost no power and little to do. He presided over the Senate, but otherwise remained largely inactive. The Adams administration was consumed by crisis. Relations with France had deteriorated into an undeclared naval war. The Federalists passed the Alien and Sedition Acts, laws that made it a crime to criticize the government, a direct assault on freedom of speech and press. Jefferson, watching from the sidelines, was convinced that the Federalists were destroying the Republic. In 1800, Jefferson and Aaron Burr ran as Democratic Republicans against Adams and Charles Pinckney. The campaign was extraordinarily bitter, with newspapers on both sides printing accusations that range from the merely personal to the completely fabricated. Jefferson was accused of being an atheist who would burn all the Bibles if elected. Adams was accused of wanting to make himself king. Jefferson and Burr tied in the Electoral College, each receiving 73 votes. Under the Constitution, the tie had to be resolved by the House of Representatives, with each state casting one vote. The House was controlled by Federalists who hated Jefferson, but feared Burr even more. After 36 ballots and a week of deadlock, Alexander Hamilton intervened, urging Federalists to support Jefferson as the lesser evil. Jefferson won. On March 4, 1801, Thomas Jefferson took the oath of office as the third President of the United States. It was the first transfer of power from one party to another in American history, accomplished peacefully through an election rather than through violence. Jefferson would later call it the Revolution of 1800, as significant in his mind as the Revolution of 1776. In his inaugural address, delivered in a voice so quiet that many in the audience could not hear him, Jefferson called for unity. "We are all Republicans, we are all Federalists," he said, trying to heal the partisan divisions. "Let us restore to social intercourse that harmony and affection without which liberty and even life itself are but dreary things." It was a beautiful sentiment. Whether he could actually govern according to it remained to be seen. Jefferson's presidency would last 8 years, from 1801 to 1809. They would be years of triumph and contradiction, of actions that expanded American power while raising troubling constitutional questions, of high ideals compromised by practical necessity. His first priority was to undo what he saw as Federalist excesses. He pardoned everyone who'd been convicted under the Sedition Act. He reduced the size of the Army and Navy, believing that standing military forces were threats to liberty. He cut government spending and eliminated internal taxes. He worked to reduce the national debt, which he viewed as a chain on future generations. But the most consequential act of his presidency came in 1803, and it required Jefferson to violate his own constitutional principles. The Louisiana Territory, the vast region between the Mississippi River and the Rocky Mountains, was controlled by France. Napoleon had acquired it from Spain, and briefly dreamed of rebuilding a French empire in North America. But his ambitions in Europe and the Caribbean proved more pressing. When he offered to sell the entire Louisiana Territory to the United States for $15 million, Jefferson faced a dilemma. The purchase would double the size of the United States. It would secure American control of the Mississippi River and the port of New Orleans, essential for Western commerce. It would provide land for the agricultural expansion Jefferson believed was essential to America's future. But nowhere in the Constitution was the federal government granted power to acquire new territory. Jefferson, who had spent years arguing for strict interpretation of the Constitution, had no constitutional authority to make the purchase. He considered proposing a constitutional amendment to authorize the acquisition, but the opportunity might disappear if he delayed. Napoleon might change his mind. So Jefferson did what Hamilton would have done. He broadly interpreted federal powers and made the purchase, justifying it as an exercise of the treaty-making power. The Louisiana Purchase was brilliant policy, but questionable constitutionalism. Jefferson knew it, and it bothered him, but he did it anyway. Principle gave way to pragmatism, consistency to opportunity. He sent Meriwether Lewis and William Clark to explore the new territory, to find a route to the Pacific, to catalogue the resources and establish American claims. The Lewis and Clark expedition would become one of the great American epics, but it began as Jefferson's scientific curiosity and imperial ambition combined. Jefferson won re-election easily in 1804, carrying every state except Connecticut and Delaware. His second term would prove more difficult than his first. Foreign policy problems dominated. Britain and France were at war, and both nations interfered with American shipping. Britain impressed American sailors, claiming they were British deserters and forcing them into the Royal Navy. France seized American ships trading with Britain. Jefferson responded with an embargo, forbidding American ships from trading with foreign nations. He believed that economic pressure would force Britain and France to respect American rights. Instead, the embargo devastated the American economy, particularly in New England, where trade was the lifeblood of prosperity. Merchants evaded the embargo through smuggling. Jefferson responded by expanding federal power to enforce it, using methods that would have outraged him if a Federalist had employed them. The embargo failed completely and was repealed just before Jefferson left office. It was the greatest policy failure of his presidency, and he knew it. Through these years, Jefferson continued to own enslaved people, continued to manage Monticello as a slave plantation, continued to profit from the labor of people he claimed to own. He spoke occasionally about the evils of slavery, but he did nothing to end it, nothing to free the people he enslaved, nothing that would have cost him personally. When he left office in March 1809, he was 65 years old. He had been in public service with only brief intervals for more than 40 years. Now, finally, he could retire to Monticello permanently. He would live another 17 years, spending them exactly as he had always wanted: reading, building, farming, corresponding with friends and fellow thinkers across the world. But he would never escape his contradictions or his debts, and the final years would bring their own struggles and sorrows. The Monticello that Jefferson returned to in 1809 was his masterpiece and his burden. He'd been designing and redesigning the house for more than 40 years. It was now complete, or as complete as it would ever be, an elegant neoclassical mansion with the distinctive dome, filled with ingenious innovations and beautiful objects. But Monticello was also the center of a plantation that depended entirely on enslaved labor. More than 200 people lived on the property. Most of them were enslaved. They worked the fields, tended the livestock, cooked the meals, cleaned the house, made the clothes, performed every task required to maintain the estate and Jefferson's lifestyle. Jefferson's retirement was active and engaged. He rose at dawn and spent the morning reading and writing correspondence. His letters numbered in the thousands, exchanges with scientists, philosophers, and political figures across America and Europe. He designed buildings for the University of Virginia, which he was working to establish. He conducted agricultural experiments. He received a steady stream of visitors who came to Monticello to meet the former president and author of the Declaration. But the debts were crushing. Jefferson owed more than $100,000, a staggering sum. The interest alone exceeded any income his lands could generate. He sold property to pay creditors. He borrowed more money. Nothing was sufficient. He was living far beyond his means and had been for decades, sustained only by credit and the slow sale of assets. In 1815, he sold his personal library to Congress. It became the foundation of the Library of Congress. The sale brought him $23,950, which he immediately used to pay creditors. Then he began buying books again, unable to stop himself from acquiring the volumes that filled his life with meaning. In 1826, as his health failed and his debts mounted, Jefferson made the decision to seek permission from the Virginia legislature to hold a lottery to sell Monticello and most of his property. The lottery was a way to avoid a humiliating public auction. The legislature debated the request, and eventually sympathetic citizens raised enough money to forestall immediate bankruptcy, but the fundamental problem remained. When Jefferson died, his estate would be insolvent. He spent his final years in increasing physical pain. His health had been robust for most of his life, but age and chronic diarrhea wore him down. He could no longer ride his horse for hours through the countryside. He spent more time in his chair, reading, writing, receiving visitors. One visitor who came repeatedly was the Marquis de Lafayette, the French nobleman who had fought in the American Revolution. Lafayette toured America in 1824 and made a pilgrimage to Monticello. The two old revolutionaries, both now in their 80s, embraced and spoke of the days when they'd been young and the world had been full of possibility. Jefferson also reconciled with John Adams. The two men, once close friends, then bitter political enemies, had resumed their correspondence in their retirement years. Their letters, exchanged over more than a decade, discussed philosophy, politics, religion, and the meaning of the lives they had lived. It was one of the great epistolary friendships in American history. In his final year, Jefferson was largely confined to Monticello, too weak to travel. He continued to write letters, to receive visitors, to design modifications to his house. He worked on a revised version of the New Testament, cutting out all the supernatural elements and leaving only Jesus' moral teachings, a project that revealed Jefferson's own religious views. He believed in God and in moral law, but he rejected miracles, the divinity of Christ, and most traditional Christian doctrine. As July 1826 approached, Jefferson's health deteriorated rapidly. He was wasting away, his body failing. But he was determined to live until July 4th, the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. He had been invited to Washington for a celebration, but was too ill to attend. He sent a letter instead, one of his last pieces of writing, expressing his hope that the Declaration would be to the world what I believe it will be, the signal of arousing men to burst the chains under which monkish ignorance and superstition had persuaded them to bind themselves. On the night of July 3rd, Jefferson slipped in and out of consciousness. His family gathered around his bed. Late in the evening he asked, "Is it the 4th?" "Not yet," they told him. He held on. On July 4th, 1826, at approximately 12:50 p.m., Thomas Jefferson died. He was 83 years old. At nearly the same moment, 500 miles away in Massachusetts, John Adams was also dying. His last words were reportedly, "Thomas Jefferson survives." He was wrong by a few hours. Jefferson had died earlier that morning. The two men, friends and rivals, architects of independence, died on the same day, 50 years to the date after the Declaration they had both signed. Thomas Jefferson was buried the next day at Monticello, in the small graveyard he had designed. His grave was marked by a simple stone, obelisk, which he had designed himself. The epitaph which he had written made no mention of his presidency or his many political offices. It read, "Here was buried Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration of American Independence, of the Statute of Virginia for religious freedom, and father of the University of Virginia." These were the achievements he wanted remembered: the Declaration of Human Equality, the separation of church and state, the institution of learning. Not the presidency, not the Louisiana Purchase, not the political battles, the ideas. His death plunged his family into financial ruin. The estate was insolvent. Everything had to be sold to pay creditors: the house, the lands, the furnishings, and the people. In 1827, 130 enslaved people were sold at auction. Families separated, children sold away from parents. The human beings who had built and maintained Monticello scattered to other plantations across Virginia. Sally Hemings was not among those sold. Jefferson's will had freed her 2 sons, Beverly and Madison. His daughter Martha informally freed Sally herself, allowing her to leave Monticello and live in freedom with her sons. Sally lived another 9 years, dying in 1835, having spent 50 of her 53 years enslaved to Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson's legacy is vast and contradictory, impossible to reduce to simple judgment. He was a visionary who could see humanity's potential for self-governance and equality. He was also a hypocrite who preached liberty while practicing slavery. He championed limited government while expanding executive power. He advocated for strict constitutional interpretation while making the Louisiana Purchase. He believed in human equality while constructing elaborate theories of racial hierarchy. The words he wrote in the Declaration have echoed across 2 centuries. Abraham Lincoln would invoke them in opposing slavery. Martin Luther King Jr. would stand on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial and quote them in demanding civil rights. Independence movements from Haiti to Vietnam would cite them. The Declaration became what Jefferson hoped it would be, a statement of universal principles applicable not just to Americans in 1776, but to all people in all times. Yet those same words condemn him. If all men are created equal, then slavery is an abomination. If liberty is an unalienable right, then Jefferson violated that right every day of his adult life. He knew this. He had to know this. And he chose his comfort, his way of life, his property over his principles. Modern scholarship has forced a reckoning with Jefferson that earlier generations avoided. The relationship with Sally Hemings, once dismissed as a Federalist lie, is now accepted as historical fact. The brutality of the slave system at Monticello, once soft-pedaled, is now documented and displayed. The contradiction at the heart of Jefferson's life is no longer glossed over or explained away. Some argue we should reject Jefferson entirely, that his slaveholding and his hypocrisy disqualify him from reverence. Others argue that we can honour the ideals while condemning the man's failures to live up to them. Still others suggest that the contradiction itself is the point, that America itself is defined by the gap between ideals and reality, and Jefferson embodies that gap perfectly. The University of Virginia, which Jefferson founded and designed, now grapples with his legacy. Monticello, now a museum, presents the full story, the architectural genius and the enslaved craftsmen who built it, the enlightened philosophy and the brutal system that sustained it. The Jefferson Memorial in Washington includes his words about equality alongside acknowledgement of his slaveholding. His ideas shaped the American conception of democracy. His vision of a nation of independent farmers, while never fully realized, influenced westward expansion and land policy. His advocacy for religious freedom helped establish the separation of church and state. His emphasis on education as essential to self-government inspired generations of reformers. His scientific curiosity and careful observation contributed to American intellectual development. But he also helped entrench slavery in American law and practice. His notes on the state of Virginia, with its theories of black inferiority, provided intellectual ammunition for defenders of slavery for generations. His failure to free his own enslaved people, or to work seriously for abolition, represented a massive moral failure that enabled the continuation of the institution for another 80 years. Perhaps the most honest assessment is this: Thomas Jefferson was a man of extraordinary gifts and extraordinary flaws, a brilliant thinker who could articulate eternal truths about human equality while living in daily violation of those truths. He saw clearly that slavery was evil, yet he lacked the courage or will to free himself from it. He understood that future generations would judge him harshly for this, yet he chose comfort over conscience. The words survive him, outlast him, transcend him. All men are created equal means more than Jefferson intended, and more than he would have been comfortable with. The words escaped his control, took on lives of their own, became tools for people Jefferson would have considered unequal to use in demanding their own equality. And perhaps that is the final irony, that the slaveholder's words became the abolitionist's weapon, that the racist's declaration became the foundation for civil rights, that the hypocrite articulated truths that revealed his own hypocrisy. Jefferson believed that the dead should not govern the living, that each generation must think for itself, that no authority should be accepted without question. By that standard, he would expect us to judge him, to grapple with his contradictions, to take what is valuable in his thought while rejecting what is abhorrent in his practice. The man is dead. The ideals remain. The contradictions endure. And America, the nation he helped create, still struggles to close the gap between the promise of equality and the reality of injustice, still wrestling with the legacy of the man who wrote that we're all created equal, while denying equality to those he owned. If you have travelled with me through this complex and troubling story, I hope you will take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment telling me what aspect of Jefferson's life struck you most forcefully. I read every comment and truly value hearing from you. Until our next journey into the past, I wish you a calm and peaceful night. Thomas Jefferson rested at Monticello, beneath the mountains he loved, the contradictions he embodied still unresolved, his words still echoing through a world he helped create and could not fully imagine.